Unfortunately, I think they witnessed the same thing, and they hit Murder Inc., which is Irv Gotti company, destroyed it. They hit Suge Knight, Death Row, and they came at me in a massive way, all the way up to the point where they put a man on me that killed 8 people.
In August of 2019, a federal jury in New Orleans convicted a Drug Enforcement Administration agent on 7 felony counts, including perjury, obstruction of justice, and falsifying government records. On the street, people called him the White Devil. For more than a decade, his unofficial assignment had been simple: take down a Houston record executive named James Prince. He never managed it. Prince has said he eventually hired his own investigator, and what that investigator claims to have found about the second agent working the case, a man who reportedly shot 8 people while on duty and still climbed the ranks, sounds less like a personnel file and more like the plot of a movie. That's not even the strangest part of this story, it's just where it starts. Over the next 4 decades, this same man would survive multiple federal drug investigations without a single conviction, discover the artist who introduced Drake to the world, get blamed by name for some of hip-hop's most violent nights, and build a fortune several journalists have tried and failed to fully trace. Some people call him the godfather of Houston hip-hop. Others quietly call him something closer to a mob boss who happens to own a record label. We pulled the actual court filings, depositions, and on-the-record interviews to see which version holds up, and which version is internet mythology that's outrun the facts. Some of it is genuinely wild. Some of it, once you check it, falls apart completely. Here's the real story of Prince. James Prince was born in 1965 and raised in Houston's 5th Ward, a neighborhood so violent through the 70s and 80s that longtime residents nicknamed it the Bloody Nickel. In his own telling, in interviews, and in his 2019 memoir, The Art and Science of Respect, Prince has said his path out wasn't a clean one. He's acknowledged being involved in street activity as a young man without ever fully spelling out what that meant, and he said the moment that pushed him toward legitimate business was watching his own mother become addicted to crack cocaine. He started with cars, running a lot called Smith Auto Sales, reconditioning and reselling vehicles to Houston's athletes and hustlers. Prince had saved over $100,000 by his early 20s, enough to buy a ranch and a house for his mother. In 1986, he opened a record label above that same car lot, mostly to give his younger brother something to do besides get into trouble on the street. He called it Rap-A-Lot. Within a couple of years, the roster included a rapper from the neighborhood named Brad Jordan, who the world would come to know as Scarface, alongside Willie D and a performer called Bushwick Bill. Together as the Ghetto Boys, they made music that was violent, uncompromising, and impossible for the industry to ignore. New York had the East Coast lockdown. Los Angeles had NWA. Nobody in the industry was checking for the South. The Ghetto Boys changed that. Prince, barely into his 20s, had put an entire region on the map. Success brought federal attention fast. Starting in the late 1980s and stretching well over a decade, the DEA investigated Rap-A-Lot on the theory that the label was really a front for laundering drug money. Prince says he was arrested on drug charges more than once during those years. Here's the detail that should stop you: he was never convicted. Not a single time. He's always maintained the evidence against him was planted, and his support in Houston ran deep enough that busloads of protesters once showed up outside police headquarters on his behalf. 2 agents in particular treated Prince like a career project: Chad Scott and his partner, Jack Schumacher. According to Prince, they parked near Rap-A-Lot's offices for years and pulled over anyone who came or went. He said a congressional inquiry into the investigation, prompted partly by allegations of racial profiling, helped bring the whole thing to a halt around the year 2000. Then, in 2019, we found out exactly who had been chasing him. Chad Scott, the agent who'd nicknamed himself the White Devil, was convicted on 7 felony counts. Prosecutors proved he'd directed a Houston drug trafficker to buy him a $43,000 pickup truck as a bribe, then falsified the seizure paperwork to make it look official. Evidence at trial showed he'd handcuffed Rap-A-Lot employees during a traffic stop and taken a necklace off one of them. He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. Prince didn't hold back once the verdict came down. He called it vindication, 2 decades in the making. Scarface had been naming Scott and Schumacher in his own lyrics as far back as the year 2000. At the time, it read like paranoia. It wasn't. The most important part of this chapter almost never gets told, and it has nothing to do with Prince at all. Scott and Schumacher's corruption didn't just chase a record label, it helped put an innocent man in prison for murder. In 1997, a Houston man named Earl Perry was shot dead during a dice game in the 5th Ward. A local man named Lamar Burks was eventually convicted of killing him and sentenced to 70 years, despite insisting he was 300 miles away in Louisiana, at his sister's wedding when it happened. Scott and Schumacher built that case, and according to later court filings, tried to use it to tie the murder back to Rap-A-Lot. After Scott's own corruption conviction became public in 2019, 2 of the key witnesses against Burks came forward and recanted. One said Scott coerced his original statement. The other, a man named Clayton Brown who'd also been convicted in the shooting, signed a sworn statement admitting he was one of the actual gunmen and that Burks wasn't even at the scene. The Houston ASCP and civil rights attorney Ben Crump have since pushed publicly for Burks's exoneration. As of the most recent reporting available, he's still incarcerated and isn't eligible for parole until 2030, meaning he's already spent more than half his life in prison for a killing the government's own witnesses now say he didn't commit. Sit with that for a second. The federal case built to prove James Prince was a criminal ended up proving that some of the agents chasing him were the actual criminals. And a man with no connection to any of it is the one who's still paying for their lies. So if the federal government couldn't make anything stick, where does Prince's reputation as someone genuinely dangerous actually come from? For decades, the unwritten rule for any artist doing business in Houston has been simple. You check in. You let Prince, or one of his sons, know you're in town. Prince has never denied starting the custom. In one interview, he said flatly he'd take the blame for it. He's described it as hospitality, as building relationships and keeping visiting artists connected to the culture. As the phrase picked up a much darker reputation online, he's since pushed back hard on the idea that it amounts to extortion, pointing out that a man with his money doesn't need anyone's cash. Here's why the idea stuck anyway. Prince has said that during a period of tension with Jay-Z, he knew the exact moment Jay-Z's plane touched down in Houston, and that because Jay-Z skipped the courtesy call, things reportedly didn't go smoothly for him at his hotel afterward. Prince never explained what that meant. He didn't have to. Nothing about checking in is ever stated as a threat outright. The entire system runs on implication. Think of it less like the old mob line about what a nice business you've got here, and more like a toll booth built entirely out of reputation. There's no invoice. There's no contract. Artists have planned trips to Houston the way you'd plan around bad weather. That reputation got tested publicly in 2018 when burglars broke into NBA YoungBoy's Houston home while he was out, apparently knowing exactly where to find his car keys. YoungBoy said afterward that all they actually got away with was a pair of flip-flops and some cash, and that whoever took it then tried to ransom the items back for $30,000. He refused, went public on Instagram, and the burglars vanished. That's when Prince stepped in on camera, announcing he'd personally recovered YoungBoy's belongings and was returning everything. Keys to a Rolls-Royce and a McLaren included. YoungBoy wasn't grateful. He told Prince publicly to mind his own business. Nobody has ever been convicted for the break-in, but a robbery nobody could solve, followed immediately by Prince arriving as the man who solved it, is exactly the kind of sequence that's fueled 2 decades of speculation about how protection actually gets sold in that city. Some of Prince's reputation for leverage doesn't come from speculation at all. It comes from people with no reason to make him look scarier than he is. Take Floyd Mayweather. Prince managed him for about 4 years in the early 2000s before Mayweather chose not to renew their deal and moved on. According to legendary boxing promoter Bob Arum, who told this story on ESPN years later without being asked, A group of men showed up at Aram's gym not long afterward and went after members of Mayweather's camp with baseball bats. The next day, Aram says, Mayweather came to his office and told him Prince wanted his cut from Mayweather's upcoming fight and that Prince, unlike everyone else in boxing, doesn't deal in letters of credit. Aram wrote a check for $600,000 on the spot. Asked years later whether Mayweather had been afraid, he wouldn't say no either. In his own memoir, Prince tells a similar story about Geffen Records almost pulling out of a distribution deal over an early Ghetto Boys album being too violent to release, saying he had associates get close to a Geffen executive and hand him a phone mid-conversation. The label released Rap-A-Lot from the contract within days. It's a great story. It's also entirely Prince's own account of his own legend, which doesn't make it false, but it's worth hearing the way you'd hear anyone's version of their own origin story, probably true in spirit, sharper in the retelling. His son Jas built the family's single biggest financial win almost by accident. In 2007, Jas found an unknown Canadian rapper on MySpace and pushed hard enough to get Lil Wayne to hear him freestyle over the beat for a milli. That rapper was Drake. The deal that followed gave Jas and his company, Aspire Music Group, a cut of Drake's future earnings, but as Drake's career exploded, Jas says the payments slowed to almost nothing. He sued Cash Money Records in 2012, accusing the label of freezing him out once the numbers got too big to justify sharing. The case dragged through counter lawsuits, and a court-ordered audit before settling in 2016 for $11 million, and 2 years later, Jas was back in court suing Birdman again over the same money. Whatever you think of how this family does business, it was a paper trail, contracts, audits, a judge. And it worked. Then there's the version of Prince who shows up whenever two other artists are already fighting. In 2014, after rumors spread that Diddy had struck Drake outside a Miami club, Prince released a recorded message warning Diddy that touching a member of his extended family would open Diddy's own family up to the same treatment. Nothing came of it publicly on either side. In 2021, with Drake and Kanye West trading years of public shots, a video surfaced of Kanye standing next to Prince, visibly tense, reading a request for peace between the two of them. Not exactly the posture of a man known for backing down from anybody. And when Megan Thee Stallion went to court to get out of her contract with her old label 1501 Certified Entertainment, both Prince and 1501's Carl Crawford were ordered to sit for depositions, pulling Prince's name into a legal fight that, on paper, had nothing to do with him. None of these situations end in an arrest. None of them end in violence anyone can point to. What they have in common is a pattern. Prince positions himself at the center of someone else's conflict, says something pointed enough to be remembered, and the conflict quietly ends. That pattern turned genuinely dark in September of 2022. A well-known Chicago jeweler known as Duke the Jeweler flew to Houston for a Boosie Badazz concert. That night, he joined a high-stakes dice game connected to J. Prince Jr., Prince's oldest son, and reportedly won close to $100,000. He had no security with him. The following night, walking back to his car, he was ambushed, robbed of his jewelry and his winnings, and shot to death. As of the most recent reporting available, no one has been convicted in his killing. J. Prince Jr. has denied any involvement or advance knowledge of what happened. But online, the pattern was already too specific to ignore. A visitor comes to Houston, ends up at a dice game tied to the Prince family, and doesn't make it home. 2 months later, hip-hop lost someone much bigger. And this is the story most people think they already know. If you've spent any time in this part of YouTube, you've probably heard the version that went viral, that a member of the Prince family personally handed the gun to the man blamed for Takeoff's death. We pulled the actual search warrants and court filings on this one, and what they show is messier than the viral version. It's also, in its own way, Takeoff and his uncle Quavo were in Houston as guests of Jas Prince, supporting a celebration for another of J. Prince's sons. The night ended at a private party at a downtown bowling alley. Outside, a dice game turned into an argument between Quavo and 3 other men, including Prince's son Michael. A member of Quavo's own crew, a man named Willie Bland, threw a punch, later telling police he believed the other men were about to rob Quavo. Gunfire broke out. Police say at least 2 people fired weapons that night, and Bland admitted he was one of them, though investigators concluded his position didn't line up with Takeoff's actual injuries. The man Houston prosecutors charged with murder is named Patrick Xavier Clark, someone who, based on everything in the court record, wasn't part of the Prince family circle at all. Surveillance footage allegedly shows Clark firing toward the group while holding a wine bottle in his other hand. He left that bottle behind at the scene, and the fingerprints on it became central to the case against him. He's pleaded not guilty, claims self-defense, and after 3 years of delays is finally set to stand trial this coming November. None of that stopped the backlash aimed at the Prince family in the days afterward. Video circulated showing Jay Prince Jr. walking past Takeoff's body in the chaos, and it spread for exactly the reason you'd expect. Months later on a podcast, the family's explanation was that the clip was a few seconds pulled from a much longer night, that Jay was on his way to wash blood off his hands, and that his brother Michael was the one who stayed behind trying to help. Whether you believe that account is genuinely up to you. What the court record does not currently support is the specific claim that's traveled the furthest online, that someone in the Prince family armed the man responsible for Takeoff's death. That detail doesn't appear anywhere in what prosecutors have actually alleged. That correction matters for more than just getting one fact right. It's the clearest possible example of how this entire mythology works. The true story here, a chaotic argument over a dice game, more than one person pulling a trigger, one specific man now awaiting a jury, is tragic enough on its own. It didn't need an extra villain. But the idea that the Prince family orchestrated it is a cleaner story than the truth. And clean stories travel a lot further online than messy, accurate ones do. So what's actually left once you set aside the parts of this story that don't hold up? You're left with a man investigated by the federal government more than once and convicted of nothing, partly because some of the agents chasing him turned out to be criminals themselves. Criminals who may have helped send an innocent man to prison for a murder he didn't commit. You're left with a business reputation built less on anything provable and more on the fact that almost nobody has ever wanted to be the one who tests it. And you're left with real lawsuits, real settlements, and real feuds fought out in public, sitting right alongside 2 decades of online mythology that's grown well past whatever the paperwork supports, including, as it turns out, the very story that made his name trend the hardest. Maybe that's the most fitting thing about James Prince. He never needed to be a mob boss. The possibility that he might be one has done nearly as much work for him and required a lot less proof. What do you think actually holds up here and what doesn't? Drop it in the comments. This is one of those stories where the paper trail and the legend genuinely don't agree, and it's worth arguing about.